When Mehmed III became Ottoman Sultan in 1595, his first official act was to execute his 19 brothers, not out of cruelty, but because Ottoman law required it, and this policy had kept the empire stable for 200 years. 19 princes, all strangled with silk bowstrings on the same day. The youngest was just 11 years old. And here's the strange part. While every other medieval empire was busy ripping itself apart, the Ottomans used this practice to hold together for 623 years. The Ottomans didn't just tolerate fratricide, they codified it, made it law, celebrated it as statecraft. But that wasn't their only counterintuitive strategy. Every few years, Ottoman officials would arrive in Christian villages across the Balkans and Anatolia. They'd line up boys between 8 and 18 years old. Then they'd take the smartest, strongest ones, by force. These children would never see their families again. They'd be converted to Islam, educated in palace schools, and transformed into the empire's most powerful administrators and elite soldiers. The system had a name, Devshirme, the blood tax. And for 3 centuries, these former Christian slaves ran one of history's most powerful empires, while the Sultan's own relatives were either dead or locked in cages. 2 policies that sound like nightmare dystopia, except they worked better than anything Europe tried during the same period. The question isn't whether these practices were brutal. They were. The question is why abandoning them helped destroy the empire. Let's get specific about what worked actually means. Between 1299 and 1922, the Ottoman Empire lasted 623 years. The Roman Empire, if you count from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus, lasted 503 years. The Mongol Empire fractured into warring khanates within 80 years of Genghis Khan's death. The Ottoman succession system prevented civil war for over 2 centuries. Not reduced it, prevented it entirely. Compare that to the Mughal Empire, where succession battles killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians every generation. Or medieval France, where the 100 Years' War started partially because nobody could agree on inheritance rules. The Devshirme system ran from 1383 to 1648. It built an entire administrative class that owed everything to the Sultan and nothing to the local aristocrats who might challenge him. At its peak in the 1500s, nearly every Grand Vizier, the equivalent of Prime Minister, was a Devshirme graduate. So were most provincial governors. So were the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that made Ottoman armies nearly unstoppable for 250 years. The empire's Christian subjects provided the manpower that conquered Christian Europe. And it worked because the system was designed to make loyalty more valuable than identity. But here's the part that historians still argue about. When the Ottomans finally abandoned these practices in the 1600s, when they tried to become more civilized, more humane, the empire began its long, terminal decline. Coincidence or causation? And that's just the beginning, because the real question is, how do you build a system so brutal that it becomes stabilizing? Over the next 12 minutes, we're going to examine exactly how these 2 systems worked, why they succeeded for so long, and what happened when Ottoman reformers tried to dismantle them. You'll learn the specific legal code that made fratricide mandatory, written in 1478 by a sultan who'd watched his own father spare brothers and nearly lose the empire because of it. You'll see how the Devshirme system turned kidnapping into meritocracy, and why Christian families sometimes volunteered their sons for enslavement. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. We're going to track the exact moment these practices ended and watch the Ottoman state unravel in real time. Because the most disturbing lesson of Ottoman history isn't that brutal systems worked, it's that the empire couldn't find a way to survive without them. By the end, you'll understand why one of history's longest-lasting empires was also one of its most morally troubling, and why the question of brutal efficiency versus humanitarian governance isn't nearly as simple as we'd like it to be. Every empire has a story. Let's find the unexpected twist. To understand why the Ottomans institutionalized fratricide, you need to understand what happened when they didn't use it. 1402, the Battle of Ankara. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I faces Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, who commands an army of Central Asian horsemen that's already destroyed a dozen kingdoms. Bayezid loses. Badly. He's captured, imprisoned in a cage, and dies in captivity 8 months later. The Ottoman Empire should have ended right there. Most empires would have. But what happened instead would become the blueprint for the next 3 centuries. But Bayezid had 4 surviving sons, and over the next 11 years, those 4 brothers fought a civil war that killed more Ottoman soldiers than Tamerlane had. Suleiman controlled the European territories, Mehmed held Anatolia, Isa grabbed a chunk of the south, Musa emerged later as a 4th claimant. None of them would compromise. None of them would share power. From 1402 to 1413, the Ottoman state barely functioned. Trade collapsed. Territories declared independence. The Byzantine Empire, which the Ottomans had nearly finished off, got a 60-year reprieve because the Ottomans were too busy killing each other. Mehmed I finally won in 1413. He'd killed all 3 brothers, and when his son, Murad II, took power in 1421, Murad remembered the lesson. He had his infant brother strangled immediately. No civil war followed Murad's death. None. His son, Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, took this lesson and made it law. In 1478, Mehmed II added a clause to the Ottoman legal code. It's short, disturbingly short. Whichever of my sons inherits the Sultanate, it behooves him to kill his brothers in the interest of world order. Most jurists have approved this. Let action be taken accordingly. World order. That's the phrase he used. Mehmed II had just conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and establishing the Ottomans as a world power. He'd watched his grandfather's empire nearly collapse because nobody wanted to kill their relatives. So he made mercy illegal. And it worked. When Mehmed II died in 1481, his son Bayezid II took power and immediately executed his brother Jem. Except, Jem escaped to Europe, where he spent years trying to raise an army with Christian backing. He became a bargaining chip between the Pope, the King of France, and various Italian states. The threat was real enough that Bayezid reportedly paid the Pope 40,000 ducats a year to keep Jem imprisoned in Rome. When Jem finally died in 1495, possibly poisoned, Bayezid sent a thank you gift to the Pope. One surviving brother had nearly destabilized the empire for 14 years. The law of fratricide suddenly looked less like cruelty and more like insurance. But fratricide was only half the system, because the Ottomans had a second problem: aristocracy. Every medieval empire faced the same structural weakness. Landowning nobles became powerful enough to challenge the crown. They married into each other's families, built regional power bases. Eventually, they'd install their own candidate as king, or carve off their territory as an independent state. The Holy Roman Empire was barely an empire at all, just a loose coalition of German princes who ignored the emperor whenever convenient. France spent centuries fighting rebellious dukes. England had the Wars of the Roses, where rival aristocratic factions killed each other over succession for 32 years. The Ottomans watched this happen to their neighbors and decided, we're not having an aristocracy at all. Instead, they'd build their government from slaves. The Devshirme system began in the late 1300s under Murad I. The word means collection or gathering. Here's how it worked. Every 3 to 7 years, Ottoman officials called Devshirme recruiters would tour Christian villages in the Balkans, Anatolia, and later Greece and the Caucasus. They'd assemble all boys between roughly 8 and 18 years old. They'd check teeth, build, intelligence. They'd ask the local priest or village elder who the smartest boys were. Then they'd take them. Quotas varied, but historians estimate 1 boy for every 40 households. Between 1500 and 1600, that meant roughly 200,000 boys taken over the century. The boys would be marched to Istanbul or other training centers, converted to Islam, not optional, given new names, taught Turkish, Persian, Arabic, trained in administration, military tactics, Islamic law, court etiquette. The smartest ones entered palace schools, the Indarun, where they'd study for up to 14 years. These graduates became governors, judges, treasury officials, diplomats. The less academically gifted, but physically strong ones became Janissaries. And here's the key detail. They legally remained slaves of the Sultan for their entire lives. A Grand Vizier could command armies, control the treasury, govern provinces, but he owned nothing. When he died, everything reverted to the Sultan. He had no family connections to leverage, because his birth family was Christian and far away. He couldn't build a dynasty, because his children weren't automatically eligible for his position. Ibrahim Pasha, Grand Vizier under Suleiman the Magnificent from 1523 to 1536, was born a Christian in the Balkans. Taken in the Devshirme, rose to become the second most powerful man in the empire. When Suleiman suspected him of disloyalty in 1536, Ibrahim was executed overnight. No trial, no rebellion, no civil war, because Ibrahim had no power base. Everything he had came from the Sultan and could be taken back just as easily. This was the system. Fratricide prevented succession wars. Devshirme prevented aristocratic rebellion. Together, they created a state where power flowed in only one direction, from the Sultan downward. And for 200 years, the Ottoman Empire expanded relentlessly. Constantinople fell in 1453, Hungary in 1526. They besieged Vienna in 1529. At their peak in 1683, Ottoman territory stretched from Algeria to the Persian Gulf, from Hungary to Yemen. But there's something we haven't answered yet, something that makes this entire system more complicated than it first appears. If Devshirme was slavery and fratricide was murder, why did the system have supporters among the people it brutalized? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Some Christian families volunteered their sons for the Devshirme. Not most, probably not even many, but enough that Ottoman records mention it repeatedly, and enough that the empire eventually had to pass laws prohibiting voluntary enrollment. Why? Because for a Christian peasant family in the Balkans, having your son taken in the Devshirme was the only path to real power. A Christian boy in Ottoman territory could never become a judge, a governor, or a general. But a Devshirme graduate could become all three. He could rise to Grand Vizier, effective ruler of an empire of 30 million people. Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, 1520 to 1566, the Ottoman Golden Age, was administered almost entirely by Devshirme graduates. Pargala Ibrahim Pasha, Greek Christian origin. Rustem Pasha, Croatian Christian origin. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, Serbian Christian origin. 3 Grand Viziers in a row, all former Christian slaves. And they weren't tokens, they were extraordinarily competent. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, Grand Vizier from 1565 to 1579, proposed digging a canal between the Don and Volga rivers to connect the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. The project failed, but the ambition was real. He also organized the construction of the Suez Canal's predecessor, a canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. That project was abandoned due to cost, but it shows the scope of Devshirme administrative thinking. These men coordinated tax collection across 3 continents, maintained standing armies larger than anything in Europe, and kept supply lines running from Budapest to Baghdad. And here's the structural genius of it. They couldn't betray the Sultan because they had nowhere else to go. A French duke who rebels against the king can flee to England or the Holy Roman Empire. He has lands, wealth, family connections. A Devshirme official who rebels has nothing. His birth family is Christian, powerless, and often doesn't even remember him. His wealth is legally the Sultan's property. His children can't inherit his position. Rebellion is irrational. Loyalty is the only logical choice. Now let's return to the question we opened with. Why did Mehmed III execute 19 brothers in 1595? Because the alternative was civil war. And by 1595, the Ottomans had watched that alternative play out in neighboring empires for 2 centuries. The Safavid Empire in Persia, founded 1501, spent its first 50 years in constant succession crises. Shah Ismail I's death in 1524 triggered a 10-year regency where different factions fought for control. His son, Tahmasp I, spent the first decade of his reign fighting off his own brothers and regional governors. The Mughal Empire in India had it worse. When Emperor Humayun died in 1556, his son Akbar took power, but only after defeating his half-brother in battle. When Akbar died in 1605, his son Jahangir rebelled twice before even taking the throne, then executed or blinded potential rival relatives. When Shah Jahan died in 1658, his four sons fought a brutal civil war. The winner, Aurangzeb, killed three brothers and imprisoned his father. Every single succession a war. The Ottomans found a way around that problem. They'd just kill all the other princes. The price was silk bowstrings. Mehmed III didn't execute his brothers because he was cruel. He did it because his great-great-grandfather had written it into law, and that law had prevented 5 generations of civil war. But here's what nobody expected. Mehmed III was the last sultan to follow the law. In 1603, when Mehmed III died, his son Ahmed I took power. Ahmed had a brother, Mustafa, and Ahmed didn't kill him. This was unprecedented. Every sultan since 1478 had executed brothers immediately. Ahmed refused. Why? Partly conscience. Partly because Ahmed was only 13 when he took power, and his advisors convinced him that executing a child, Mustafa was 11, would be too scandalous even by Ottoman standards. But there was a practical problem. Ahmed was young. If he died without an adult heir, the empire would need Mustafa to prevent a succession crisis. So instead of fratricide, the Ottomans invented something new, the kafes, the cage. Mustafa and later princes were confined to a section of Topkapi Palace, comfortable rooms, servants, concubines who were given contraceptives so they couldn't produce heirs, no education in statecraft, no military training, no contact with the outside world. The princes would live there for decades, waiting to either die or become sultan. When Ahmed I died in 1617 at age 27, his brother Mustafa, who'd spent 14 years in the cage, became Sultan Mustafa I. He lasted 3 months before being deposed as mentally unfit. Turns out locking someone in a gilded prison for 14 years doesn't produce competent rulers. Who knew? The cage system continued for the rest of Ottoman history, and almost every sultan after 1603 was either incompetent, paranoid, or both, because they'd spent their formative years in isolation, with no training, waiting to be murdered or crowned. The Devshirme system broke down around the same time, but for different reasons. By the mid-1600s, the empire had stopped expanding. No new conquests meant no new land to distribute as rewards. The Janissaries, who'd once been elite slave soldiers, started demanding the right to marry, own property, and pass their positions to their sons. In 1566, Janissaries were forbidden from marrying. By 1650, most of them were married. By 1700, Janissary status had become hereditary, which meant the Janissaries were no longer slaves loyal only to the Sultan. They were a hereditary military caste with their own political interests. The Devshirme recruitment itself ended in the late 1600s, partly because Christian communities had become better at hiding their sons or bribing recruiters, partly because the system had become corrupted. Muslim families were bribing their way into palace schools, defeating the whole purpose. By 1700, the two systems that had stabilized the Ottoman Empire for 3 centuries were effectively dead, and the empire began to rot from the inside. The 18th century Ottoman Empire looked nothing like the 16th century version. Sultans were weak. Many were deposed by Janissary revolts, the same Janissaries who'd once been the empire's most loyal troops. In 1703, Janissaries overthrew Sultan Mustafa II. In 1730, they overthrew Mahmud I. In 1807, they overthrew Selim III and killed him. The administrative class became hereditary and corrupt. Positions were bought and sold. Provincial governors stopped sending tax revenue to Istanbul and ran their territories as personal fiefdoms. The empire that had once expanded into 3 continents started losing wars to Russia, Austria, and Persia. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz forced the Ottomans to cede Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of the Balkans to Austria. First major territorial loss in Ottoman history. In 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt, an Ottoman province, and the Sultan couldn't stop him. Britain had to intervene to kick the French out. By 1826, Sultan Mahmud II was so desperate to modernize that he abolished the Janissaries entirely. When they revolted, he had them massacred. Thousands killed in a single day. The empire lingered for another century, but it was functionally dead. It became the sick man of Europe, a phrase coined in the 1850s. By 1914, it controlled less territory than it had in 1450. World War I finished it off. The Ottoman Empire officially ended in 1922. Now here's the modern parallel, and it's more uncomfortable than anything we've discussed so far. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq and dismantled the Ba'athist government. The Coalition Provisional Authority issued Order No. 1, de-Ba'athification. Anyone who'd been a member of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party was banned from government positions. The goal was noble: remove the corrupt authoritarian elite and build a democratic system. The result? Iraq's entire administrative class disappeared overnight. The people who knew how to run power plants, manage water systems, organize logistics, pay civil servants, gone. Order No. 2 disbanded the Iraqi military. 400,000 trained soldiers suddenly unemployed, many of them armed. Within 3 years, Iraq descended into sectarian civil war. By 2014, ISIS controlled a third of the country. Look, nobody's saying Saddam's system was good. It was brutal and oppressive. But it worked. It held the country together. And dismantling it without a replacement created a vacuum that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The Ottoman parallel is exact. Fratricide and Devshirme were morally indefensible. But they solved structural problems that the empire never figured out how to solve any other way. When the Ottomans abandoned those systems for more humane alternatives, they didn't replace them with anything equally effective. The cage system produced incompetent sultans. Hereditary Janissaries became a corrupt military caste. The empire spent 2 centuries slowly collapsing. And here's the question we still don't have a good answer for. Is it possible to build a stable, long-lasting state without some form of structural brutality? The Ottoman Empire lasted 623 years by doing things that would be considered war crimes today. Modern democracies have existed for, at most, 250 years, and many of them are showing serious structural stress. In 2024, Freedom House reported that global democracy declined for the 18th consecutive year. 52 countries experienced democratic backsliding. Authoritarian governance is now more common worldwide than democratic governance. The United States, the world's oldest continuous democracy, has experienced 2 presidential elections where the loser contested the results, in 2000 and 2020. Peaceful transfer of power, once assumed to be automatic, is now uncertain. The European Union faces recurring crises over member states like Hungary and Poland sliding toward authoritarianism while remaining in a democratic union. The structural tension between national sovereignty and collective governance has no obvious solution. We like to think that moral progress and institutional effectiveness go hand in hand. The Ottoman Empire is a case study in why that's not always true. The systems that kept the empire stable for 3 centuries were monstrous. The systems that replaced them were more humane and less effective. And the empire never found a third option. The Ottoman Empire didn't fall because it was brutal. It fell because it stopped being brutal, without learning how to be something else. History doesn't care about making us comfortable. Sometimes the truth is that horrible systems worked and humane alternatives failed. The Devshirme system raises a question we didn't have time to fully explore. What happened to the Christian communities that lost their sons? How did they resist, adapt, or collaborate with a system designed to take their children? That's the next video. Now, we've been telling this story from the palace, but there's another side to it, the one told in Balkan villages where the children were taken. That video's already up. Thanks for watching.